We left off pasuk in Shalach, pasuk Yudches. Torah tells us for Chamushim Olu Bnei Yisrael Eretz Yisrael. The Bnei Yisrael left Chamushim. So Rashi, the first interpretation, Chamushim and Chamushim Elu Muzionim. They left Egypt armed. They had weapons. The fish had Hesibosam the Midbar who Goram Lehem Sholu Chamushim. Since he took them into the desert, which were the circuitous route, they had weapons. Shulo Esiba Derech Yishuv, because if you would have taken along the settled communities, they wouldn't need the weaponry and everything else. Elo. The person travels through a settled location, whatever he needs, he has. He doesn't have to contend with dangers and provisions. He has the provisions. But if you know you're going out to the desert, you have to prepare whatever's necessary. So if you're going to the desert, one of the things you have to prepare is what? Is weapons. And the reason why the Torah has to introduce this, why is it important for us to know that they took weapons with them? When we fought Amalek, when we attacked in the desert, and the war with Og, where did they have weapons from? As it says, the Jews, they smote them with the sword. Where do they have swords? The answer is, when they left Egypt, they prepared for the possible eventuality. Not war, but they're going to a desert. Going to a desert, you have to go armed. Let's stop for a moment. According to this first interpretation, if you'd read the story, the narrative as it reads, when they left Egypt, they knew they could have gone based along the Philistine route, which is not into the desert. Not into the desert. He took him the circuitous route. You take the circuitous route, you go through the desert. So evidently, from this, it seems to be, they knew when they left Egypt, they're going to the desert. Ultimately, they knew they're going to the desert. And that's what we said earlier. Even though they knew they were going to the desert, and they had no provisions other than weapons, what do you need? What are you going to survive on? And that's why the Navi says, I'll always remember the chesed of your youth, the love of our beginning. You went into the desert, a location that's not planted. How does one do that? The answer is pure faith. That trust in Hashem, whatever's needed, He will provide. Even though on a natural level, it's something you have nothing. Whatever Hashem says, that is the security. That's the basis for the security. They went out with weapons. It's interesting. The question is, seemingly, if they're leaving with miracles, as they did, until now, the Egyptians who died, the Jews did not lift a finger. There was no encounter between the Jews and the Egyptians. Whoever had to be vanquished, Hashem vanquished them. So, in their minds, what do they think? They're going to take weapons. Why do they have to take weapons? Hashem will perform whatever miracle has to be performed to vanquish their enemies. Kriyas Yamsuf, the Egyptian armies, how did they die? They had no involvement. The sea came down on them, and that was the end of the Egyptian armies. It's only the first encounter was Amalek. Now, why did they have to use weaponry with Amalek? Because why were we attacked by Amalek? Because we failed. because we failed over there where we complained about the water, Hashem sent Amalek, who did not fear God, because since we said God is not within our midst, we were attacked by a people who didn't believe in God. So that was due to a failing. So initially, when they went out, did they consider that they may be attacked? Seemingly, there would have been a consideration. Evidently, they were instructed. We find that there's an obligation to have a standing army. That anybody above the age of 20 was conscripted. That's called Yotzei Latzova. You're conscripted into the army. But initially, when they were supposed to conquer Canaan, it was supposed to be miraculous. So Ramban writes that there's the concept of Ein Somchen Al Hanes, that we have no right to rely on miracles. We have to do whatever we can to a certain point. Beyond that point, Hashem takes over. We have a standing army. It's not we're going, you have no choice. If you have no choice, what do? You have no choice but to rely on a miracle. But here, if you could take initiative and you don't take initiative, the miracle doesn't necessarily happen. It's only once we've taken the full initiative, only then does God perform the miracle. It's interesting. When we speak about Parnasa, one's yearly stipend, although the Gemara says that one's yearly stipend is set from Rosh Hashanah till the next Rosh Hashanah, nevertheless, if you sit back and do nothing, and you take no initiative, you realize you're not getting your stipend. So what does it mean? It's been set. So the Mesilas Yesharim explains that when Adam ate of the Eitz Hadas, he was cursed. Mankind was cursed. What was the curse? You can eat bread by the sweat of your brow. So there's a prerequisite to release the stipend. You have to what? You have to take initiative to the level that is Zeis Apecha. Once you've met that prerequisite of Zeis Apecha, by the sweat of your brow, Hashem releases that stipend to you. But that's a prerequisite. So there, why do we have to take initiative? Not because Ein Somchen Al Hanes. Not because Ein Somchen Al Hanes. The reason is because of the curse of against Adam Rishon, Zeis Apecha Toch Alechem. But over here, here we say Ein Somchen Al Hanes. It's a different concept. Because we live in a real world, and in a real world, we have to prepare and take in consideration eventuality. And God gives us means and ability to do such. You do your best. Once you've done your best, are you going to succeed or fail? That's up to Hashem. That's Ein Somchen Al Hanes. Up to that point, we have to do whatever we have to do. Beyond that point, God takes over. So they're going into a desert. We'll maybe be confronted with enemies, whatever it may be. We're going to conquer Eretz Yisrael. But yet we had a standing army. Although when we went to Yericho, the walls just sunk into the ground. And if not for the Chet HaMeraglim, we would have had to lift a finger. And there were giants. Initially, when the Meraglim saw what they saw there, it's not a problem. Because God will clear the enemy. We just walk in, the enemy falls dead. But because we failed with Chet HaMeraglim, we're worthy of that level of miracle. There was miracle, but we had to take that initiative. But nevertheless, even before the Chet HaMeraglim, there was a standing army from the age of 20 and above, you were conscripted into the army. And so the Rabbans, that's Ein Somchen Al Hanes. So I'm saying that they took weapons now, they had no idea what the future will bring. They had faith in God. But since there's a concept of Ein Somchen Al Hanes, therefore they took weaponry, because we have to do what we have to do. How things are going to manifest themselves later, that's up to Hashem the way they're going to manifest themselves. We're not worried. We'll have victory. Either we'll do it ourselves or Hashem will do it for us. But we have to plan for the eventuality that we may need weapons. That's the understanding. The other interpretation is Chamushim doesn't mean weapons. Chamushim, Echad Michamisho, Yotzu. 1/5 of the Jews left Egypt. And 4/5 died during the days of darkness. because we said they didn't have sufficient faith to go out. So the fifth that went out, we're talking about this is the fifth that has that special level of trust in Hashem, that willing to go into a wilderness. So all the complaining that follows beyond this point is this particular fifth, who initially had this exceptional level of trust that, as we'll see in a moment, they were even willing to go into the lion's jaw, not worried they're going to have their head snapped off. Because we're going to see when they were told to travel back towards the Egyptians, they traveled. They had such faith in Hashem, such trust, but were fleeing from the Egyptians. And they knew they were pursuing them at that time. Nevertheless, they said, if Ben Amram says, travel towards the enemy, you travel towards the enemy. That was to confuse the enemy. So the enemy should be entrapped. But the enemy misunderstood what was going on. They said the Jews are trapped in the desert because Hashem left one deity of the Egyptians that they believed that one deity would actually come to save them. But that was only a ploy to entrap the Egyptians. At that point, the Jews still had that faith. We're in the desert, and yet we're fleeing from the enemy, from our taskmasters, our masters. God says, travel back, you travel back. But soon after that, when we came to Kriyas Yamsuf, and we were confronted, we were stuck between the deep blue sea and the enemy, then a certain segment started to complain of the lack of grapes. Because then that was the first time we felt the reality between a rock and a hard place, no wiggle room. What do you do now? Even then that's a true test of faith. That's putting their feet to the fire at that moment. How do you process this moment? Do you have that trust or don't you have the trust? You know, 4/5 of Jews not to leave Egypt, that's a big number. I mean, God could have orchestrated it. Why didn't they have faith? Because they were concerned they wouldn't have provisions. Hashem could have put in their minds that there will be. He could have showed them you'll have enough provisions that you don't have to worry. But yet, Hashem says, no, right now you're on your own. You have to prove to me where you stand. Do you stand because you have faith, or you stand because you're being shored up that you're able to stand, but you can't stand on your own 2 feet? To be worthy and qualified to be taken as Hashem's people, you have to have a certain level of faith. If you don't meet that grade, you don't meet the grade. You're not worthy of becoming the Am Hashem. Why did we originally bring the Korban Pesach? The Korban Pesach, that was a statement. The lamb, the sheep, was the deed of the Egyptians. A prerequisite to leaving Egypt, we had to take that and slaughter it for Hashem. But it's the deity of the Egyptians. And they were idolaters initially. They believed that had value, that had power. But you have to come to a level of understanding that there's no other power other than God himself. How was that position confirmed? Because they took the lamb or the goat 4 days before the 14th of Nisan to check it for blemishes, and on the 14th they slaughtered it. That was a necessary prerequisite to be worthy of redemption. The other 4/5, even if they would have done that, but they didn't have sufficient faith. This group, they're the ones who were ready to go into the desert. They had sufficient faith. But even that wasn't enough. They had to take the deity of the Egyptians and slaughter it. That was terminating that relationship with the past. The other 4/5, they didn't have sufficient faith to be worthy to stand at Sinai. As a result of that, they perished during the days of darkness. I'll give you an example. You know, you want to go to a certain university, MIT. You know, you have to have a certain degree of intellect. You have to have an IQ. You have to have a certain background in education in certain subject matters, and you have to excel in those areas. Otherwise, if you don't make the grade, all you can do is maybe walk through the doors. But for them to accept you as being a student in their curriculum, you don't make it through the door. To stand at Sinai, you had to prove yourself that you had that trust in Hashem. To become the Am Hashem, which was the fourth expression of redemption. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. What level do you have to be? You have to be at that level of trust. And if you're not at that level of trust, if that's the case, you don't stand at Sinai. Therefore, 4/5 who were not at that level of trust, because they did not trust God to go into the desert, because they didn't have that financial security. God says, if that's the case, you people don't make it. So the Jews continue living. The value of a Jew is only to become the Am Hashem, the descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And if you're not going to meet that objective, if that's the case, you die during the days of darkness for that reason.